our appreciation to the Belton Chamber, the Georgetown Chamber, the Parker Heights Chamber, the Killeen Chamber, the Round Rock Chamber, and the Greater Waco Chamber. Thank you very much. We do this partnership quite a bit throughout the year. A couple items. First of all, we ask that you do remain muted. And we also ask that you turn your camera off, if you will, please, because except for the speakers, that way that will allow for better reception for the program. We are using the chat feature on Zoom. So as you have questions, please route your questions that direction. And then we get to that point in the agenda, we will ask the questions that have been submitted. So now it's my honor to introduce to you the chairman of the board of the Temple Chamber of Commerce, Drayton McLean III. Mr. McLean.
Well, thank you, Rod, and thanks to everybody. I don't think we've ever had a gathering with 5 or so of the local chamber, so good to see everybody, and thanks for joining in. And I get to introduce our speakers today, and both are from the U.S. Chambers of Commerce. I'll introduce Thomas first. Thomas Sullivan has been a career advocating to the government on behalf of small business. He's currently the Vice President, Small Business Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So he talks to people like us or things all around the country, kind of gets the gauge of what they feel is happening and struggles and victories and other things that come along and pass it along and make a great representation for small businesses in the halls of Congress, the Senate, and government agencies and everywhere else. But Thomas has had a career advocating to the government on behalf of small businesses at the law firm of, excuse me, Nelson, Mullins, and Riley and Scarborough. Also, he had worked with the as counsel for the Bipartisan Policy Center, and also served in President Bush, George W. Bush's administration with the Small Business Administration as the advocating small business needs for agencies in Congress. So he's got a great career and lots of experience that can help us out with the changing environment. I would mention that he is a graduate of Boston College and also has a law degree from Suffolk University Law School. So Thomas, and lives in Virginia area. So surprised, he's near the DC area. So thanks, Thomas. And you'll be hearing from him after our first speaker. Allison Dembeck is the Vice President of Education and Labor Advocacy, Governmental Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and has been that role for a while, and has also, like Thomas, has been heavily involved in government, Congress, and the Senate for her career. She's worked as the same areas, education, labor, welfare areas for Senator John Thune of South Dakota, and also Senator John Barrasso of West Wyoming. She's also been with the Ceridian Corporation and advocated on their behalf, and also has worked for the House of Representatives on education and workforce, both during John Boehner's tenure as committee chairman, then also under Representative John Klein. So Alison has another expert that can give us some good counsel. So Alison is a graduate of the Binghamton University, that's State University of New York, and then also has a master's degree from George Washington University. So the floor will be yours. You guys just give us everything that you think is important, and we'll be sure to get to you with questions and comments at the end of the program. So Alison, I'll sign off here and let you take the floor. And again, thanks for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and all of us. Thank you guys for taking your time out to do this. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. I am going to share my screen and give a quick slides and then turn it over to Tom, and then we can get to your questions, which in some ways is probably going to help you more than anything. So just give me a second to get that all, the wonders of Zoom. Okay, we are sharing. And all right, I think we are good. All right, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about vaccinations and liability and the employer role of it all. Let me start with the premise that it is definitely our shared purpose to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible. Things are obviously changing very quickly, particularly in the vaccination world. I mean, just look at yesterday's announcement with the J&J vaccine, so we definitely are trying to stay on top of things, but the response is dynamic and it's fast moving. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, as well as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, has really done some of our own research. We've held our own conversations at all levels of government. We haven't just been working with the federal government. We've been working with our state and local governments, as well as our state and local chambers and with businesses of all sizes, to make sure that we're really helping our leaders dig into what communities actually need and how we can help support them. Before we start, though, I think it would be good to have a little bit of just level setting in all of this. The CDC estimates that actually about a quarter of the US population has been infected with the coronavirus. That's actually 3 times the number of confirmed cases, but obviously not everybody was symptomatic, or some people thought it was allergies, a variety of different reasons why that number is so much higher. And unfortunately we've lost more than 500,000 lives to COVID over the last year, a little more. And that's the equivalent of losing more than the population of the Killeen, Temple, Fort Hood metropolitan area in about a year. I mean, it's a significant number. And then that last number, despite the chaotic rollout of the vaccine, it is important to remember that the US is a world leader when it comes to vaccination. There are only a few developed countries that are ahead of us when you look at the per capita vaccination rates. So while we might all individually be frustrated, there is a lot of work and a lot of good work being done in this space. Now, Tom, afterwards, is going to talk about this kind of second portion of this slide, the extra business support. But in terms of just in general, the American Rescue Plan, which was a $1.9 trillion bill, was the latest in a series of federal relief efforts. And we can answer questions about other relief efforts or other questions about the bill, but it's important to note that in addition to the small business provisions, there were $115 billion designated for the health and COVID response work, whether it's vaccination work and testing and tracing and all of that. Plus, obviously, none of that touches on the $1,400 in direct payments, the UI extension, the tax credits for employers offering paid sick and family leave. It was obviously a massive bill, but this $115 billion for the health and COVID response is really important money. And we've been talking with members about how to understand what's happening and to plan for all of that and the challenges ahead and ways that we can help support the response. Now, I know I'm probably preaching to the choir with this slide, but in our conversations, these are the common concerns and questions that we've been getting, and we are working to solve them and to help educate our members and our federation about what they can do. And so in doing that, we've actually set up a website, and I have the the website at the bottom here, but I'll be sure to put it in a link in the chat as well so that you all have it. And this is our digital resource center. And on it, it literally answers most of these questions, if not all of them. There's general guidance about what's happening with COVID. There's state-specific vaccination information. There's also best practices on how to communicate about vaccines with your employees. We're going to go a little more into that, but this is going to be a really, really important role that you all play as employers. And then there's obviously the important questions around developing your own vaccination strategy and how to go about doing that. We have information there, including on whether or not you should actually encourage or require vaccines. There are also obviously a lot of legal questions that come up, and so we have a good Q&A section on the website to help answer some of those common questions. I'll also mention that tomorrow between 2 and 3 Eastern, if you're available, the U.S. Chamber's President and CEO Suzanne Clark is sitting down with experts from Ernst & Young, Pfizer, and Forest Hills of DC to discuss the unique approaches that all 3 of them have taken to overcome vaccine hesitancy, as well as some of the perceived conveniences, best practices for vaccination, and how they're handling that with their workforce. So I highly encourage you to attend the Path Forward event if you can. And then obviously, in addition to bringing together these resources to help answer some of these questions, we've been talking with the new administration as well as the state and local officials, because at the end of the day, it's actually at the state and local level where a lot of these challenges lie. Now, vaccine hesitancy is probably the biggest thing to overcome. While states have increased the speed with which they're getting the vaccine out to people, this is where things get really important, and there's a lot of room for improvement. In general, supply remains really low. We suspect that will be aggravated by the situation with the J&J vaccine. The thought had initially been that sometime towards the end of April that supply and demand for the vaccine were going to even out, and then we were going to actually see a flip so that instead of not having enough vaccines, we were going to move to a situation where there were not enough people who were ready, willing, and able to be vaccinated. I haven't seen the latest numbers of how that plays out now, but expect that to happen, if not this month, next month. It is coming down the pike. And in thinking about it, Pew Research did some surveys, and they found that 30% of the people that they asked were not planning to get the vaccine, and the reason why was concerns about side effects, which obviously are a big barrier, but also there was concern about the fact that they were developed too fast to be safe. And I'm sure that the J&J vaccine has not, the situation hasn't necessarily helped with that, but there is a massive campaign effort to talk to the groups where there are really 3 groups that are to talk about access and apathy and outright skepticism to getting the vaccine. So that education campaign is going to mostly focus on young people, people of color, and people who are politically conservative. So that's what's one of those interesting things that, we did an event a couple weeks ago with Frank Newport, who is a polling guru for Gallup. And he said at the time, and people were surprised, and then we did some of our own polling, and it showed that party identification actually is the single greatest predictor of whether or not an individual is willing or unwilling to be vaccinated. Leading up to the election, as you can see, there was a little bit of a difference, but it was pretty close. But after the elections, the Republicans' resistance to getting the vaccine demonstrated a really sharp upturn. And now both political parties have seen a decline in resistance to getting the vaccine, but still the conservatives remain the ones who are the the most hesitant. And you're probably asking why all of that matters to you, but the reality is that as employers in the community, you are people that your consumers and your employees, they trust you. And we need to embrace people getting the vaccines if we have any hope of controlling the epidemic and getting the economy back up to speed. Employers can't solve this problem on their own, but in an era of fake news and in an era of declining trust in the media, the employers are a natural messenger in all of this. So that's why we have worked with a data science company to figure out the best way to talk about all of this. How do we message it so that our employees and our consumers can see the best reasons for getting the vaccine? And in this, actually, this slide shows some important takeaways. First, and most importantly, is business leaders can exert a positive effect simply by leading the way on this. And secondly, of all of the things, the employers talking about vaccine effectiveness or by saying that you're willing to pay people to get it, offering an incentive like that, that's actually not going to be effective at all. It's actually going to actually exacerbate the hesitancy. So instead, we're looking at models as like what Walmart did what Walmart does with the flu shot. When the flu shot comes out every year, they have their managers at a staff meeting roll up the sleeve at their staff meeting and get the flu shot. And so when you're leading by example, I mean, that's really what we're talking about. So we're encouraging employers to really over communicate with employees and customers to, if possible, host vaccination clinics and consider ways to make it easier for workers to get the shot and deal with the after effects. So while it's not paying them, maybe you're offering some time off to be able to get the shot or to deal with the after effects, because sometimes there are side effects. At the same time, we also think it's critical that businesses engage in ongoing dialogue with their state and local officials. Imagine what would happen if every business in America had the opportunity to vaccinate not only its employees, but also their families. And if every single chamber made this point to federal, state, and local officials, there's a real opportunity for businesses to help vaccinate America and get everyone vaccinated and back to work. Sure, we might still have to wear masks for a bit and socially distance for a little bit. And it definitely is going to take a collective effort, but it also will help us overcome the vaccine hesitancy. It reduces burden on the public health system, which is also important, particularly to taxpayers. And it does make it easier for millions of us to get vaccinated. So dialogue with your employees is important. They are open to, from the polling that we've seen and done, they are open to continued protocols in the workplace, like wearing masks and social distancing. However, I know many of you have questions about mandating vaccines, and so I would like to just point out that nearly half said that they would be very or somewhat concerned if the employer mandated it. Again, it goes back to that other slide about mandating or incentivizing by paying them. That's not really what is going to help. We want to really set up the opportunities and really lead by example, but mandating it is going to actually potentially cause more hesitancy. So I know we want to hear from Tom, so let me just encourage you to just plug in with the U.S. Chamber. Like I said, I'll put that website on the in the chat so you can visit it. But so we've got the Digital Resource Center, we've got those events that are happening, and when we have people working to really answer questions about the liability issues, about racial disparities in the pandemic, to bolster state chamber efforts. Developing playbooks for employers of all sizes, and to create an environment where we really can have these public and private partnerships working to help increase vaccination. I will also say that we have established a small group of large companies that keep coming together every few weeks to compare notes and have frank conversations about what is happening with the public sector's vaccine rollout and figuring out how we can continue to improve and address concerns. The last thing I will say is that we really encourage you to get involved in the Rally for Recovery. There's a website, Commit to Recovery, where you can sign up and publicly join our Rally for Recovery. I will also put that link in the chat box. And then afterwards, I think probably once Tom is done, then we can answer questions. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and then I'll turn it over to Tom, I think.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Rod. Thank you, Drayton, for allowing for us to present this afternoon. I'm also going to try to share my screen. Might be for a slightly different reason than Allison. So one is just to see what it looks like when I had a tie on, because I think the last time I had a tie on was 13 months ago. But the other is just to kind of keep me on track. I tend to get pretty wound up about this stuff, and certainly Allison is a passionate advocate as well. But without a deck, I tend to go on these crazy tangents, and I don't want to do that. Before I jump into what the small business landscape looks like currently, I do want to say how much I wish I were down with you all in person. I had an opportunity to visit with Hester's Automotive in Round Rock a couple of years ago, and it was awesome. I learned so much from Big Boy and from some of his friends, and had such a gracious meeting with Round Rock Chamber members, small businesses and big businesses. I wish I could come back again. And at the end of the chat, I am going to ask whether or not the annual fundraising fishing trip is actually on this year. But before we do that, let me just kind of jump into what we're seeing in the landscape and then highlight some of the federal relief that is still available. Well, what we're seeing right now is what we would call a K-shaped recovery. So if you have really good penmanship, you know, that upper part of the K represents businesses that are doing pretty well throughout the pandemic. And if you look at the lower right-hand corner of this slide, you know, construction is certainly in that category. The lower part of that K are businesses not doing very well. And in this slide, you'll see that, no surprise, leisure and hospitality, so hotels and restaurants have really, really been struggling. But it's more than just the industry. It's actually the demographics as well that make up that K. And unfortunately, what we've seen, and if you look at the upper right-hand slide here that looks at some of the demographics, you'll see that minority-owned businesses have gotten hit a lot harder by the pandemic than other businesses. And, you know, when you look at demographics, unfortunately, minorities kind of get double hit according to the data. Not only they've been impacted harder than other businesses, they're actually in a less advantageous position to get a loan. Some data that we looked at last summer shows that 13% of minority-owned businesses could not get a loan compared to 8% of non-minority businesses. So not only have they been hit the hardest, they're also in the least advantageous position to bounce back. So that lower part of the K is something that federal policymakers are really looking at. A little bit more recent data that we've seen from our MetLife and US Chamber of Commerce Small Business Index. The way I would sum up the entire index is that there's a light at the end of that tunnel, and that light certainly is vaccinations. But what we found is that that tunnel is still awfully long. We have not been able to kind of break past this 50% of small businesses that believe it's going to take over 6 months for things to quote unquote return to normal. So when I mentioned how the economy's doing, I mentioned that as kind of a lead up to how federal resources have been targeted in to help the small business community. We look 13, 14 months ago, there's legislation that just said, get cash out to Main Street as quickly as possible. Not a very targeted program, but an absolutely necessary program. After several months, realized in a K-shaped economy, what can we do to really target relief to that lower part of the K? And that's where several amendments to the initial legislation, as well as legislation that was passed just after Christmas. So that was the Economic Aid Act. And then more recently, as Allison had mentioned, the American Rescue Plan. Each one of these more recent aid packages really narrows in. And for instance, shuttered live venues, there's a grant that I'll explain a little bit. And then there's a grant program specifically for restaurants as well. And again, narrowing in sector-based, there are other efforts to narrow in from a demographic perspective. So over the past 13 months, we've been pushing for help for small business and have had some success. We joined with many of you and chambers of commerce all across the United States to convince Congress that chambers of commerce that are formed usually as 501c6 nonprofits, they should be able to get PPP loans. I think personally, I think it took way too long to convince Congress that happened. It was a lot harder than it should have been. But finally, chambers of commerce who have not been able to hold in-person fundraisers for many chambers for a long, long time, they've needed to access PPP loans, and we consider that a huge success that they were able to access the PPP program by that law that was passed just after Christmas. Again, a little bit embarrassed that it took legislation to do what should have been done in the first place, and that is to allow PPP loans that are forgiven, as well as SBA disaster grants, to be tax-free. We tried to convince Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin to do this just through guidance. That didn't work out so well, and so we had to convince Congress to treat this aid as tax-free, and we were successful in doing that. Now, this is a part of my presentation that I want to make sure that folks remember this term, the Employee Retention Tax Credit. If you're a business, or if you work with businesses that has employees and you've never heard of this term, please, 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 please talk with your accountant. If you're large enough to have a bookkeeper, talk with your bookkeeper. If you use a payroll firm, ask your payroll firm, can I take advantage of this employee retention tax credit? The reason that I've got my hand up in prayer that you remember this is because recent data show that while over 78% of America's small businesses recognize and understand and are familiar with the PPP loans given by the Small Business Administration, less than 0.5% of small businesses have heard of the employee retention tax credit. So that tells me that those conversations between employers and tax preparers or payroll providers have to happen, because if they don't, potentially you're leaving cash on the table that is intended to help small businesses. We lobbied for a simplified PPP forgiveness form. And then most recently, just went into effect March 31st, there are tax credits that are available for employers to give time off to employees, and this actually extends to self-employed as well. 2 weeks for sick leave, and then there's extended provisions if there are unfortunate health ripple effects after 2 weeks. But again, if you're not familiar with that and you want to provide some time off for your employees, the federal government wants to reimburse you. Now we get into some really narrowly targeted grants. So $16 billion grant program for shuttered venues. I list up on this graphic the organization that really pushed for this legislation to be put into law, and that's NIVA, the National Independent Venue Association. It's kind of good news, bad news. The good news is they were able to convince Congress to have this grant program. Bad news is that when it was supposed to be opened up for applications last Friday at noon, the application flood of applications was so extreme that it just shut down the program. And SBA has been working nonstop to try to resolve the technical challenges with its application process. There are 2 items that have to be done in order to apply for these grants. First of all, you got to get a DUNS number. That's short for Dun and Bradstreet. The second is you got to register with the federal grants portal, and that's sam.gov. If you need help with this, the local small business development centers certainly are very helpful in helping small businesses navigate through this. There are particular criteria you have to meet in order to actually qualify for this grant. The easiest way to explain it, because there's a fairly complex formula about whether or not you have fixed seating or if it's a sporting event versus a theater event, all this stuff. Really the easiest kind of way to narrow down whether you would be eligible is to ask the question, do you gain the majority of your revenue selling tickets to a live non-sporting event? And if the answer to that is yes, then it's quite possible you will qualify for a shuttered venue operator grant. Again, this is not open for applications yet, but there are a number of things you've got to do to get ready for it to be operational and open for applications. And the guidance at SBA, which is fairly extensive, the URL is there on this slide. And these slides will be available after this presentation. Last, but certainly not least, the Restaurant Revitalization Fund grants. This is also a program that has not opened up for applications yet, but SBA is running it, and as soon as they get the live venue grants open, they're going to then turn their attention to Restaurant Revitalization Fund grants. This is something that our partners at the National Restaurant Association obviously advocated aggressively for. They are kind of the lead to bring folks up to date with what to expect. And we are hopeful that this grant program be up and running soon. Last slide here before we jump into questions with me and Allison is just that it's an acknowledgement that where Allison and I work, we're primarily an advocacy organization. We lobby for businesses. 14 months ago, we heard from many of you at Chambers of Commerce. We heard from many business owners that they appreciate our advocacy, but what they really need is information. I call it closed captioning for COVID relief. How do you boil down a 70-page regulatory document from the federal government into a one-pager that a small business owner has the time to read, understand, and act on so that they can survive? We heard the demand for information loud and clear. And so Allison and I and our colleagues pivoted very quickly to try to become an information resource. Allison already directed you all to some of the vaccination resources that we have. We have a small business digital platform called CO. And we are going to use any any means necessary to try to provide our Chamber of Commerce partners and our businesses with information that they may need to understand. We call it the R&D project at the Chamber: rip off and duplicate. We don't care whose logo is on it. We don't care, who is distributing it, just as long as it gets in the hands of business owners who can use it. So thank you for allowing me to share this information. Happy to take questions.
So, hi, Tom and Allison. We had one question come in on the chat line. It says, we are facing severe hiring and retention challenges, mainly driven by the incentive programs. People can make more money staying home than working. Perception from the employer perspective is that incentive plans have a counter effect on some sectors of the industries. Can you share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so bad news, good news. So the bad news is that impact very quickly was felt by the business community, in particular small business community. And that's what led our advocacy arm, and I'll hand it over to Allison because she was on the front lines, was to say, hey, wait a minute, like the double and triple amounts for folks not to work are having an unintended negative effect. And so we pivoted very quickly and then recommended that Congress keep a level that will allow folks to be healthy, but not at such a high level as to create a disincentive to report back to work. And so we were successful in convincing Congress to bring that level down. We've certainly heard this comment repeatedly and kind of acted very quickly on it. Allison?
Yeah, so I will just to kind of expand on that a little bit. When the first pandemic, when the first bill went through Congress, this was debated on the floor. Several senators actually were holding up the vote on that first pandemic relief bill because they felt that $600 a week extra was going to be too much and that it was going to be harmful for all businesses, but particularly small businesses. And then from that point forward, it is something that I have been hearing about every time I do one of these events, all through last year into this year. And that's so to your point, yes, that is the case. Congress did hear you and did hear the business community on this, in that when the American Rescue Plan, it extended unemployment to 73 weeks, I believe, but it did lower that $600 amount to a $300 a week amount. So it is less than what it was. So hopefully it is less of an incentive, but the incentive is still there, depending on where your income falls, unfortunately. But we do hear you, and we continue to, I in particular, this is something I work on very regularly. There's a lot of talk out there just about UI in general, about UI reform, about dealing with the trust fund, which is another huge issue. And anytime conversations about UI come up, this is one of the things that I am sure to mention, because it really is a barrier to bringing employees back into the workplace. I just wanted to point out, just as there were a couple of questions about, Tom had mentioned CO, and I put a link to the U.S. Chamber's CO website on there. And there was a question about tomorrow's briefing. And so tomorrow's briefing, again, it's from 2 to 3 Eastern. And I put a link to register in case you're interested in that event.
Oh, so Allison, as we're stalling for time to get other questions, let me give another plug for tomorrow afternoon's kind of sit down session, because within the speakers, and we all have our different parts of different programs that you really narrow in on, but for me, in the small business world, I'm particularly interested in the owner of a local nursing home who has really struggled with how to kind of enroll her employees in vaccinations. And from the small business owners I talk with, many are in that same situation. And I think that there's a certain amount of knowledge value of seeing Suzanne interview this small business owner of a nursing home, and having them kind of walk through some of the deeply personal challenges of vaccination and working with employees as a team. So I think that that's the part of the program I'm going to be particularly tuned into, but wanted to share that with the rest of the folks down in Texas. And it's great to see that the Round Rock fishing trip fundraiser is on. So I've got to think of a reason to get down to just north of Austin. But anyway, it's good to see that. That was really, I did not go on the fishing trip, but meeting Big Boy and visiting with folks in Round Rock was a highlight of one of my trips down to Texas.
So we've had, I had a direct message to me of a question. Are you seeing plaintiff attorneys going after businesses for COVID causes in the workplace?
So there has been some of that. So the chamber has a Institute of Legal Reform, and they actually recently put out a brief. And in the brief, they actually talk about how there are essentially 5 types of cases that are really coming out of the pandemic. There's the common law claims. There's the common law claims. There are labor employment claims, false claims, act claims. There's some data privacy claims, virtual meetings, health information, big data, that sort of thing. Some financial services claims, consumer claims like Telephone Consumer Act protection issues, and then security claims. So unfortunately, the chamber worked really hard trying to get liability protections for employers into the various COVID relief bills. And honestly, the Democrats were just not having any of it. It's one of those areas that we still continue to talk about and to push on. We're very concerned about what can happen. But at this point, most of the liability issues really are having to be handled by the state, because we're just not seeing an interest on the federal government's level. I will put a link into this brief for you all to read. Tom has already taken care of that.
Already done.
Thank you, Tom. It's actually, even if you don't have a law background, it is actually very accessible and easy to read, I thought. So I highly recommend looking at it if you're concerned about the liability issues. I think it gives you a good sense of where we're seeing things pop up.
Wonderful. I also had another direct message. We have heard that the U.S. Congress is considering forgiving idle repayment based on certain criteria similar to PPP. Is this a possibility?
So it's a possibility. I don't think it's a high possibility. So there's 3 parts of kind of this forgiveness thing. The first is forgiving the PPP loans that should be forgiven now. And there is growing frustration that small businesses who did the right thing want to be able to tell their banks, we did the right thing. The bank then communicate to SBA, and SBA says it's forgiven. So this concept of getting past COVID is not just something we all personally believe in, but small business owners, really, really want to get to the point of putting this behind them and freeing up capital and moving forward. We're really focusing intensely on the forgiveness of PPP. The second kind of lane is the SBA disaster program. So there is an SBA disaster loan, which is at 3.75%, 30-year fixed loan. It looks actually very similar to a traditional loan instrument, with a key difference being that instead of a loan officer, you're talking with a SBA government official, because it's SBA money. There's never the intention of the loan itself being forgiven. There's a third lane, though, that gets very confusing, and that is a set of what were called cash advances to those small businesses that applied for an SBA disaster loan, but government made a realization that government takes a long time to issue a loan, and maybe they need a cash advance to just get them through that. That cash advance was purely a grant. We were successful in lobbying Congress to make sure that that grant never be taxed. And it is quite simply a grant. It never has to be applied to be forgiven, or luckily shouldn't be taxed at a federal level, whether it's taxed at a state level. I know many states are dealing with that right now. But those are the three kind of distinct lanes that get really, really confusing, because small business owners don't have the time that Allison and I do to figure all this stuff out. And so that's a long way of saying it's been talked about, and legislatively, I put that at a very low percentage of likely passage. But many times that question comes up in the context of mixing one program with another. And part of our job is to try to clear up some of that misconception or misinformation. The reason I'm very bearish or pretty skeptical that it will pass, a lot of small businesses are getting to the point of viewing government grants as something that is propping up a part of the business community that ultimately will distort kind of the competitive environment of free enterprise. And that's the more that the economy starts improving, the more that becomes kind of front and center legislatively, where A, you're talking about billions and billions of dollars, and B, you're starting to talk about an economic distortion that is based on federal spending that unfortunately our friends in free enterprise sometimes end up at the wrong end of that distortion. And so there's an increasing sensitivity to that. That's why I'm a little bit skeptical about something like that becoming law.
Great. So I've had one more direct message question, and that is, other than the skepticism on the safety of the vaccine, the main pushback we are seeing to get the shot is the lack of incentive to see major changes on how we live. Masks, social distance, and a virtual world seems to continue to be the norm, despite having the vaccine available for all adults now. Can you share your thoughts on the CDC still requiring masks and other measures despite the vaccine being deployed?
I mean, this is where the difficulty comes in, is that while the vaccine is being administered, things have been a little slow. And so we're not at herd immunity yet. And so I think we'll start seeing changes, although I don't know if you all saw, I think it was today, Nevada announced that they are starting to open back up. I think Nevada is planning to be 100% capacity and fully open by June 1st. So places are starting to open back up. Some of that has to deal with the percentage of their population that is vaccinated. And with vaccine hesitancy and people being reluctant to vaccinate, it creates this other problem. It's why we're really encouraging you all to be leaders in helping encourage your employees and customers to vaccinate, because as we hit that level of vaccination, the issues around being able to open back up become a lot easier to address, and we can then get our economy back on track. I understand it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, but now that we're seeing more vaccine available, hopefully that can help move things along.
Whitney, I see another question about PPP. And Chris asks whether or not, well, how long it takes. So the simple answer is the smaller the PPP loan, the quicker the bank will receive back a answer from SBA that it is forgiven. The larger, and especially loans over $2 million, are taking an awfully long time. It is really frustrating. In fact, as soon as we get off this call, I've got to reach out to some of our banking community friends to see, whether we can constructively suggest, a more certain time frame. And Whitney, I'll also kind of piggyback on Allison's response about kind of, I think somewhat of a feeling of hopelessness out in the business community. Our approach for vaccinations is actually really selfish, because we lobby for the business community, and really the quickest and straightest line to making sure that we don't go into shutdowns again is to get more people vaccinated. It is a very selfish, I mean, there's other reasons for it too, but like, that's what we do. We advocate for the business community, and there is really no simpler or straighter or more efficient line to getting past COVID than getting as many folks vaccinated as possible. I wish there were a shorter, more certain way to do it, but that's all we got now. And so we're pushing as hard as we can.
Well, I want to take just a moment and thank both of you, Allison and Tom, for participating in this session briefing with us today. Just a lot of great responses on the information provided, notes taken. We look forward to, I want to go back and look at the slide decks and gain even more from your presentations. Also want to thank John Gonzalez with the U.S. Chamber, who is online with us. John was the go-to person who helped pull this all together for us today. Thank you, sir, for your involvement in supporting local business, local chambers of commerce in our efforts to inform, educate, communicate. Also, just a quick thank you to the Belton Chamber, the Georgetown Chamber, the Harker Heights Chamber, the Greater Killeen Chamber, the Round Rock Chamber, the Greater Waco Chamber for joining in on this with the Temple Chamber. Ladies and gentlemen, we will continue to be working to come up with other programs we can present to you utilizing the experts from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So with that, thank you. Again, Allison, thank you. Tom and John, thank you. And thank you to all the local chambers for participating with us today. Have a great Wednesday.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.